Second, water constraints and volatility. And third, constraints and volatility of several other commodities. These are all input factors, and we've heard the word input factor several times over the last 48 hours. These are all input factors upon which we are today expanding our economies. And as these input factors become more scarce, we will face growing challenges. Let me just briefly back this up with a couple of numbers. If you look at the most left-hand chart from your side, you see the forecast for energy for oil consumption until the year 2030. This is forecast to grow by around 20 million barrels a day to over 100 million. And if you look at the chart, you will actually see this light blue part of the chart, which is accounted for by oil fields that are yet to be developed or yet to be found. We don't have this yet. So to put it mildly, there is a gap. We see a similar picture for water. Water consumption today is something around 4,500 billion cubic meters. A recent McKinsey study forecasts this number to go up to just below 7,000 billion cubic meters. But we only have around 4,200 billion worldwide. This is a gap, again, of 40%. Business as usual puts us above the sustainable level of water that we have by 40%. And at the same time, we see growing volatility. If you look at this last chart here, you see the price of copper. You see that for years it has hovered around $1,000 to $2,000, shot up to around 9,000, come down to 3,000, and is now back up at 7,000. These are wild swings that are very difficult to absorb for economies, especially economies that use copper as an input factor, but they also make things very difficult to plan, even if you have copper and you want to export it. Now, against this background, I believe that there are two key areas to look out for. One is technological innovation, in particular clean technologies, and the other one is resource efficiency. Again, let me share a couple of numbers with you. These are already markets today that are growing rapidly. Solar energy, for instance, has grown by around 60% per annum over the last couple of years. We don't only need new technologies, I think there are also vast opportunities for more efficiency. On the middle graph, you see how Manila Water, the utility company of Manila, has reduced water losses over around 13 years, up from 63% losses in their water networks down to 15%. This shows you the vast potential of efficiency increases. This saves money and saves water. And finally, as we see new technologies emerging, we also see new commodities becoming much more important. Lithium is an example for that, because the growing demand for electric cars and thus electric batteries is also growing the amount of lithium that is being used and forecast to be used. Now, finally, as I conclude, 3 points on how this is related to exports. First, I believe this development will have a significant impact on all sectors, whether it's agriculture, whether it's industry, or whether it's services. Agriculture is a prime example. If water resources go down, agriculture will have a problem. Second, I believe moving into new areas for exports, such as clean technologies, make a lot of sense and have significant potential. And we heard the gentleman earlier from Malaysia talking about green buildings and green technologies and how this is becoming a key point for them to pursue. And finally, I think this will also have an impact on the configuration of trade and logistics. Because as transport becomes more expensive due to more expensive energy, the trade-off in what I transport, in what I produce at home, in what value makes sense to be transported, what I cannot afford anymore, will shift. And I think we'll see this also reflected in logistics networks. And in that context, also yesterday, I think it was Mr. Metzger who made the remark, due to higher shipping costs, we are limited in what we can purchase. I think this is an obvious statement. I think we might see this statement much more often as we move towards higher energy costs and other higher costs for other commodities. Thank you very much.
Well, I think our two speakers have touched on two broad issues that have underlay a lot of our discussions in terms of the realities on the ground. One has to do with technological change, which in many respects, if not all respects, is a positive. And the other has to do with the resource constraints and the constraints of a finite planet that we keep wrestling with, especially as we see lots of countries start to move through the development cycle, past the environmental Kuznets curve, et cetera. So I'm wondering, before we get into talking about policymakers' perspectives on these issues, whether the audience had any questions that they would like to direct at the two panelists who've just spoken. And again, this is day 2, so you're familiar with the drill. Please be succinct and to the point. Please identify yourself. And if you did want to direct a question at a particular panelist, please identify the panelist as well. Courtney?
Thank you. This question is for Mr. Barkawi. I agree with you. I mean, you mentioned at the outset that both Dr. Supachai and Mrs. Patricia Francis spoke about the problems of focusing on short-term planning rather than long-term sustainable planning. But my question to you, I mean, and we know why that is. I mean, what Dr. Supachai said is that governments are focused on the next election cycle. And for companies, they seem to be focused on increasing shareholder value, the next quarterly earnings reports, so they're not looking long-term either. But because of what you have said in terms of the resource constraints, at some point, the rubber is going to meet the road. So how do we actually, I mean, where is the impetus going to come from so that this does not happen? Because it doesn't seem that it's going to come from the public or the private sector going at this rate.
Thank you very much. We should have a multiple-hour discussion on that. Let me just briefly touch 3 areas that I think are crucial. The first crucial area is financial markets. I think we need to shift capital flows into new technologies. We've seen a bit of that. Venture capital investments into clean technology currently stand at around $5 billion worldwide. Interestingly, the biggest chunk of venture capital investments today in the United States is accounted for by clean technology. It's in front of information technology, it's in front of biotechnology. Clean technologies is on the top. However, this is not enough. There is a momentum among institutional investors, including pension funds, to move into that area. And I think what we could all do, and it's a minor thing, what we could all do is to, wherever we have links to fund institutions, whether it's our pension fund, whether it's our savings, whether it's a sovereign wealth fund in the country that we live in, we should push that fund to move into a more long-term way of thinking when it invests. Second, education. Not only primary and secondary, I think we also need to move these concepts into universities. There is a movement among management schools to account for these issues in teaching and research. I think there's less of a movement with regard to engineering and other sciences, and this needs to be increased. And finally, on the policy side, I think there are many, many instruments in the toolbox. Tax policy is certainly one, government procurement is a second, and others that one should look at.
Any other questions?
I'd just like to make a comment. Different parts of the world have different sustainable competitive advantages, and that's not been brought up. If you're in the 20 to 40 degrees south or north, you'll have more wind. If you're within the 10 degrees of the equator, you'll have more sunshine.